In January 1945, Soviet troops launched an offensive along a vast front from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians. In just 20 days, the Red Army advanced over 500 kilometers, liberating Warsaw and Krakow, and encircling the fortresses of Breslau, Poznan, and Königsberg. By the end of January, Soviet forces had captured bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oder River, coming within just 70 kilometers of Berlin. However, the Germans had reserves that were hastily transferred from the Western Front. An attempt to continue the offensive and swiftly capture the city of Kustrin failed. The German High Command recognized that the First Belarusian Front had surged far ahead, and Guderian proposed a counteroffensive plan to strike from East Prussia against the flanks of the Soviet troops approaching Berlin. The operation, codenamed Solstice, began on the 15th of February. Zhukov managed to repel the attack of the 11th SS Panzer Army, led by Felix Steiner, but Guderian could attempt again, making further advances toward Berlin while exposing flanks a risky endeavor. It was necessary to wait for reinforcements from neighboring fronts. Due to a lack of reserves, the advance of Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front toward the Baltic Sea was slow. At the same time, Zhukov could not assist his neighbors, as his troops were expanding bridgeheads and securing their flanks against counterattacks by the enemy. Eventually, the crisis was resolved. Part of the First Belarusian Front was redirected north by Stalin's personal order. Through joint strikes by the forces of Zhukov and Rokossovsky, the enemy was defeated in this direction, and by mid-March, the First Belarusian Front had stabilized the front line on the northern flank. Meanwhile, the troops of the First Ukrainian Front under Konev were also reinforced on the southern flank. Now it was possible to resume the offensive toward Berlin, and Stalin was eager to do so. By this time, the Germans had committed all reserves from the Western Front to fight the Red Army, allowing the Americans and British to advance toward Berlin with little serious resistance. By the end of March, Allied forces were approximately 500 kilometers from the German capital, and by mid-April, advanced units of the U.S. Army had reached the Elbe River, leaving just over 80 kilometers to Berlin. Stalin feared that the Allies would capture the city first, and they indeed had such intentions. Churchill, concerned about the strengthening of the Soviet Union after the war, suggested that they strike Berlin first, but American generals disagreed with him. Nevertheless, the exact plans of the British and Americans were unknown in Moscow, and they preferred to hurry, as the country that had made the greatest contribution to the victory over Nazism should seize the capital of the Third Reich and put a definitive end to the war. The First Belarusian Front under Zhukov was to directly assault Berlin. 3 powerful lines of defense lay in its path. On the far approaches to the city, the Germans had created 3 defensive rings around their capital outer, inner, and urban. Hitler rightly believed that the heavily fortified defenses of Berlin were impregnable. Nothing similar had been seen at Moscow, Leningrad, or Stalingrad. Some sections of the urban fortifications included multi-level defensive lines, connected by a system of tunnels and bomb shelters. This allowed Wehrmacht troops to move quickly underground and suddenly appear in the rear of the advancing units. It was indeed possible to get bogged down in such defenses. So in the spring of 1945, Berlin was not the only target for the Red Army. Part of Zhukov's forces was to bypass the city from the north and, within 2 weeks, reach the contact line with the Allies along the Elbe River. To this end, it was planned to use the 1st and 2nd Guards Tank armies, which were in reserve for Zhukov's front. The Second Belarusian Front under Rokossovsky was to cover this advance from the north, while the First Ukrainian Front under Konev was tasked with bypassing Berlin from the south and also quickly reaching the Elbe. If successful, the eastern part of Germany would fall under the control of the Red Army. For the capture of Berlin, Soviet command concentrated 42,000 guns, over 6,000 tanks, and 7,500 combat aircraft. An endless stream of millions of tons of shells, fuel, and supplies flowed to the front. These forces significantly outmatched anything Hitler could gather for the final decisive battle. The 3 Soviet fronts faced the army groups Vistula and Center. To the southeast of Berlin, the 9th Army under General Theodor Buss was holding the line, including the Seelow Heights. The Soviet offensive began on the night of the 16th of April, 1945. Following a powerful air and artillery preparation, the First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts launched their attack. In the first hours of the offensive, Zhukov's troops advanced 1.5 to 2 kilometers. However, as they approached the second line of defense, located at the Seelow Heights, enemy resistance sharply increased. The Germans had fortified this line in advance, establishing minefields, trenches, and firing positions camouflaged among forests and ravines. Additionally, around 40,000 recruits from the Volkssturm, including teenagers and elderly men, arrived in Berlin during these days. Despite the extensive artillery preparation, many of the firing points behind thick concrete bunkers remained intact. The offensive began to stall. After 2 days of fighting, the 16th of April -17, the infantry of the 8th Guards Army under Schweikhoff advanced only 5 to 7 kilometers instead of the planned 15 to 20 kilometers. Some rifle divisions suffered losses of up to 60% of their personnel on the approaches to the heights. Meanwhile, Stalin demanded the capture of Berlin by May 1, and the troops were bogged down at the first line of defense. Zhukov realized that infantry alone could not take the heights and committed his main reserves, the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies under Katakov and Bogdanov. This violated the directive from High Command, which mandated that these formations be used solely for bypassing Berlin from the north. This led to a tense conversation between Zhukov and Stalin, and they did not communicate for 3 days afterward. Meanwhile, Zhukov awaited swift development and success. However, stubborn fighting at the Seelow Heights continued without significant progress on the 17th of April and 18. The High Command began searching for solutions to the emerging problem. Zhukov had already committed his main reserves, and he could only wait for success. In contrast, the First Ukrainian Front was faring significantly better. Therefore, to expedite the capture of the German capital, the tank armies of Lyushenko and Rybalko were directed north from the Elbe. By the 21st of April, Konev's forces had broken through all 3 lines of enemy defense, crossed the Spree River, and quickly advanced to the southern suburbs of Berlin. By this time, Zhukov's troops had also managed to overcome the enemy's defenses at the Seelow Heights and were rushing toward the capital of the Third Reich. The 9th Army of the Wehrmacht, which held the front on the Oder, was cut into 3 parts. The German defense, which Goebbels called an impregnable wall, could not withstand the powerful blow and began to crumble. On the 20th of April, on his 56th birthday, Hitler awoke to the sound of Soviet artillery shells. He hid in the bunker built for him in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. The next day, Soviet troops surged onto the streets of Berlin, leading to fierce urban combat. The city was effectively turned into a fortress, with defenses established at strong points and resistance nodes, using massive stone buildings, bomb shelters, and casemates interconnected by underground communications. Many streets in Berlin, as well as approaches to bridges over canals, were barricaded. Approaches to these were mined at intersections, and 24 tanks were buried as fixed firing points. In a desperate attempt to delay their downfall, German command threw all remaining forces into battle. The main participants in the urban fighting were assault groups composed of infantry battalions, sapper platoons, and flamethrower sections, supported by several guns, tanks, or self-propelled guns. Due to the dense construction and numerous barricades, the assault often relied on underground communications metro stations, sewers, and basements became crucial routes for flanking maneuvers and surprise attacks. In some areas, the fight for a single building could last 2 days. In some cases, artillery support was provided by heavy gun batteries and Katyusha units. Tank crews advanced while covering each other, firing crossfire down both sides of the street. Following them at a distance of 30 meters, self-propelled guns destroyed unneutralized firing points. Artillerymen aimed directly at windows and embrasures. On the 22nd of April, Hitler's headquarters made the decision to transfer the 12th Army of General Walter Wenck from the Western Front to assist the 9th Army, which was nearly cut off from the city. This was the last attempt by the Wehrmacht to influence the course of the battle. On the 24th of April, Wenck's army launched a series of attacks, all of which were successfully repelled. Initially, the 12th Army was created to defend against Anglo-American forces, but as the Western Front of the Wehrmacht had effectively collapsed and the Allies were not actively advancing, all reserves were redirected against the Red Army. On the same day, Hitler appointed General Helmut Weidling as the commander of Berlin's defense, but this could no longer affect the situation. The battle was approaching the city center. Meanwhile, by Stalin's order, all of Konev's units not engaged in the battle for Berlin were sent to the Elbe. On the 25th of April, they met with the forces of the 1st U.S. Army, effectively splitting Germany into 2 parts. Stalin aimed to allow the remnants of the German forces, including Wenck's 12th Army, to attempt to break westward to surrender to the Americans. Konev's advance to the Elbe cut off that route, The remnants of the Ninth Army were encircled in the forests southeast of Berlin. Now, the capital of the Reich was defended by isolated groups of SS troops, military school cadets, and Volkssturm conscripts. The focal point of the Red Army's efforts was the Reichstag, the building of the German parliament, which had become the main symbol of the Third Reich. As Soviet assault groups advanced closer to the city's center, German resistance intensified. The Red Army applied the extensive experience gained in urban combat from Stalingrad, Budapest, and Königsberg. The assault on the city continued day and night, with all efforts aimed at preventing the enemy from organizing a solid defense and establishing new positions. By the 28th of April, the Red Army had breached the defenses in several areas of the central sector of the German capital. The Third Shock Army under Kuznetsov captured the Moabit area and reached the Spree River in the northern central part of Tiergarten Park. The Fifth Shock Army, under Berzerin, advancing from the east, took Karlshorst, crossed the Spree, and seized the Anhalt railway station and the state printing house. The 8th Guards Army under Chuikov advanced along the southern bank of the Landwehr Canal, which was the last major obstacle on the way to the government quarter. From there, only 2 kilometers remained to the Reich Chancellery. By this time, Hitler had completely resolved to end his life. On the 28th of April, he dictated his political testament, appointing Grand Admiral Dönitz as Reich President and Goebbels as Chancellor. The next day, General Walter Wenck reported that his army was encircled and could not break into Berlin. Soon, the last communication line with Hitler's bunker was severed. On the 30th of April, around 3 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. On the same day, Red Army soldiers stormed the Reichstag. After several attempts to capture it, German forces entrenched in the Reichstag cellars surrendered on the evening of May 1. The storm flag of the 150th Adritzer Rifle Division, which later became the symbol of victory, was raised on the dome of the Reichstag. Fighting continued in some areas of Berlin for another day. By the evening of May 2, German resistance was finally broken. The commander of Berlin's defense, Weidling, came to General Chuikov of the 8th Guards Army and accepted the Soviet command's offer of surrender for the German forces. Mass surrenders began. Some German units and detachments that refused to surrender attempted to break west through the suburb of Spandau but were soon destroyed. In total, over 130,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. On May 3, combat operations in Berlin ceased. Our soldiers rejoiced. This was the long-awaited victory. All Soviet tanks were instantly adorned with red flags. Soldiers danced, sang, and fired into the sky with all kinds of weapons, taking pictures against the backdrop of the defeated Reichstag. The Berlin offensive operation resulted in the destruction of the military and political leadership of the Third Reich, ultimately leading to the unconditional surrender of the country's armed forces. The main forces of the Wehrmacht were annihilated. The German command was effectively deprived of the ability to continue the war. Despite losing strategic initiative by 1945, Germany fought stubbornly until the last days. The victory over such a formidable adversary came at an enormous cost for the Soviet Union. In the battles for Berlin, 80,000 Red Army soldiers lost their lives. The Germans suffered 800,000 casualties, a significant portion of whom were wounded or captured. Approximately 100,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were killed. In Czechoslovakia, the Wehrmacht still had nearly 1 million combat-ready troops. However, when 2 tank armies from the First Ukrainian Front began to advance rapidly toward Prague, cutting off their retreat westward, the Germans began to surrender en masse. On the night of May 9, in the Berlin district of Karlshorst, the act of unconditional surrender of the armed forces of Nazi Germany was signed, which was accepted on behalf of the Soviet government by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The war, which had lasted nearly 4 years and cost the Soviet people unimaginable suffering, finally ended victoriously.